They told me the overnight shift at the abandoned Whitmore Elementary would be easy money. Just sit in the main office, make sure nobody breaks in, maybe walk the halls once or twice before dawn. What they didn't mention was why the previous 4 guards quit without giving notice. What they didn't explain was the sound of children laughing that echoes through empty classrooms at exactly 2:43 a.m. The interview happened in a McDonald's on Route 9, which should have been my first red flag. Jim Morrison sat across from me with a manila folder and coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, kept checking his phone every 30 seconds like he was expecting bad news. The job paid $1,800 a week, cash, for 6 nights of work. For weeks minimum commitment. I needed the money more than I needed answers. My divorce finalized 3 months ago. Sarah kept the house, the car, most of our savings. I kept the credit card debt and a 1-bedroom apartment in Millfield that smelled like cigarettes from the previous tenant. The therapy bills were piling up on my kitchen counter next to the overdue notices from Visa and the electric company. Dr. Martinez said I needed to process the grief, work through the anger, find healthy ways to rebuild my identity. Easy to say when you're not watching your life dissolve in real time. The security job was supposed to give me space to figure things out, maybe save enough to start over somewhere else. I thought the isolation would be therapeutic. Jim slid the contract across the sticky table. Standard security agreement, liability waivers, non-disclosure clauses that seemed oddly specific for a simple guard position. The building had been closed since 2019, he explained, when the district consolidated 3 elementary schools into a single facility. Insurance required a night watchman while they figured out whether to sell or demolish. Simple enough. If you're drawn to stories about places that shouldn't exist anymore, but somehow still do, you might want to subscribe for more mysteries like this one. The first thing I noticed about Whitmore Elementary was how perfectly preserved everything looked. Not abandoned building decay, not broken windows or graffiti or the usual signs of neglect. The hallways still had their bulletin boards up, crayon drawings of Thanksgiving turkeys and winter snowflakes still push-pinned to cork strips. The drinking fountains worked. The lights in most classrooms turned on when you flipped the switches. Someone had been maintaining this place with unusual care for a building that was supposed to be empty. Jim handed me a key ring with 17 keys and a laminated sheet of instructions. My job was to arrive at 10 p.m., unlock the main entrance, conduct a perimeter check, then station myself in the principal's office until 6 a.m. Simple patrol schedule every 2 hours. The instructions were typed on an old typewriter, the kind where certain letters hit darker than others. Some of the rules seemed standard. Others felt oddly specific. Rule 1. Enter only through the main entrance. Side doors and emergency exits are to remain locked at all times. Rule 2. Conduct perimeter checks at 12 a.m., 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. Use the provided flashlight even if overhead lights are functioning. Rule 3. If you hear voices during your shift, assume they are coming from outside the building. Do not investigate. Rule 4. The gymnasium doors will be chained shut. Do not attempt to open them or shine your flashlight through the window gaps. Rule 5. Room 14 is off limits. The door will be marked with yellow tape. Do not remove the tape or enter the room under any circumstances. Rule 6. If you encounter any individual on school property between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., immediately call the number provided and exit the building. Rule 7. Keep all lights in the main office on throughout your shift. Never work in darkness. Rule 8. If you hear the fire alarm during your shift, evacuate immediately. Do not attempt to locate the source or check if there is an actual emergency. Rule 9. Log all activities in the provided notebook. Include times, locations visited, and any unusual observations. Rule 10. At exactly 3 a.m., Walk to the center of the main hallway and remain still for 60 seconds. Count silently. Do not react to anything you hear during this time. I read through the list twice. Most security jobs had basic guidelines about when to call police, how to handle trespassers, standard liability procedures. This felt more like instructions for avoiding something rather than protecting something. I asked Jim about Rule 10 specifically. Why stand in the hallway for a full minute at 3 a.m.? He looked uncomfortable, said it was an insurance requirement related to building settlement. Old buildings make noise as they shift, he explained. The insurance company wanted documentation that the structure wasn't experiencing unusual stress. That explanation didn't make sense, but I needed the job more than I needed logical answers. My first night started normally enough. I arrived at 9:55 p.m., unlocked the front entrance, and found the main office exactly as Jim had described it. Principal's desk, visitor chairs, filing cabinets, a computer that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2015. The provided notebook was spiral-bound, college-ruled, with about 30 pages already filled in by previous guards. I flipped through the entries, looking for patterns. Most were routine. 10:15 p.m., arrived, building secure. 12 a.m., perimeter check complete, no issues. 2 a.m., all clear, but scattered throughout were entries that made me pause. 12:30 a.m., heard music from room 7, possibly radio left on, did not investigate per Rule 3. 1:45 a.m., footsteps in north hallway, assumed settling noises. 2:43 a.m., children laughing outside building, lasted approximately 4 minutes. The handwriting changed between entries, confirming that multiple guards had worked this position, but all of them mentioned the same timestamp, 2:43 a.m. Different phenomena, but always the same time. My first perimeter check at midnight revealed nothing unusual. The building felt empty in the way schools feel empty, that particular silence that comes from spaces designed to hold hundreds of people, but currently holding none. Classroom doors were closed, but not locked. Through the small windows in each door, I could see desks arranged in neat rows, whiteboards with faint marker stains, reading corners with tiny chairs arranged in circles. Everything waiting for children who wouldn't return. The only door that stood out was room 14. Yellow police tape covered the entrance in an X pattern, and someone had added a handwritten sign, "Authorized personnel only." I shined my flashlight through the small window, but couldn't make out much detail. The room looked darker than the others, even accounting for the lack of illumination. I made a note in the log and continued my rounds. Nothing happened during my first few hours. I read a paperback novel I'd brought, dozed lightly in the principal's chair, checked my phone for texts that never came. The building settled occasionally, pipes creaking, heating systems cycling on and off. Normal sounds for a structure this old. At 2:40 a.m., I prepared for my second perimeter check and noted the time carefully. The previous guards had all mentioned 2:43 a.m. as significant, and I wanted to be paying attention when that moment arrived. I walked to the main hallway, flashlight ready, listening for anything unusual. 2:41 a.m. Silence. 2:42 a.m. Still nothing. 2:43 a.m. The sound started exactly on schedule, and it wasn't coming from outside. Children's laughter, bright and delighted, the kind of sound you'd hear during recess or a birthday party. But it was coming from inside the building, specifically from the direction of the gymnasium. Multiple voices, maybe 8 or 10 kids, laughing at something genuinely funny. The sound lasted exactly 4 minutes, just as the previous guard had noted, then cut off abruptly at 2:47 a.m. I stood in the hallway holding my flashlight and trying to process what I'd heard. The logical part of my brain offered explanations. Sound can travel strangely through empty buildings. Maybe the laughter was coming from outside and just seemed like it originated internally due to acoustic properties. Maybe it was teenagers who had found another way into the building and were playing some elaborate prank. But the sound had been too clear, too close, and too precisely timed to be coincidental. This was the fourth guard to document the exact same phenomenon at the exact same time. That suggested either an incredibly dedicated group of pranksters or something else entirely. Have you ever been in an empty building and heard sounds that shouldn't be there? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. I returned to the office and wrote in the log, 2:43 a.m. Children laughing from gymnasium area. Duration approximately 4 minutes. Investigated per Rule 3 assumption of external source. It felt important to follow the rules exactly as written, even if I was starting to suspect they were designed to prevent investigation rather than encourage it. The remaining hours of my shift passed without incident. I completed my 4 a.m. perimeter check, noted nothing unusual except for the persistent feeling that I was being observed. Not by anyone specific, just the general sense that the building wasn't as empty as it appeared. I'd worked security before, mostly office buildings and retail spaces, and I'd never experienced that particular sensation of benign surveillance. When 6 a.m. arrived, I locked up and drove home feeling unsettled but not frightened. The job paid well, the work wasn't difficult, and hearing unexplained sounds wasn't necessarily dangerous. I could handle strange noises if it meant paying off my credit cards and getting my life back on track. My second night followed the same pattern. Arrive at 10 p.m., settle into the office, conduct scheduled perimeter checks. At 2:43 a.m., the children's laughter returned exactly as before. Same duration, same apparent location, same abrupt ending. This time I paid closer attention to the details. The laughter wasn't echoing the way sound typically echoes in empty hallways. It had an immediate quality, as if the sources were very close to where I stood. And underneath the laughter, I could hear something else. Not words exactly, but vocal patterns that suggested conversation. Children talking to each other in the gymnasium that was supposed to be chained shut. After the sounds ended, I walked toward the gymnasium despite Rule 3's instruction to assume voices were external. I didn't plan to violate Rule 4 by attempting to open the doors or look through the windows, but I wanted to confirm that the chains were still in place. If someone was actually inside the gym, there would be evidence of forced entry. The gymnasium doors were exactly as described. Heavy chains with industrial padlocks, the kind that would require bolt cutters or serious tools to remove. The gaps between the doors were too narrow to allow anything larger than a pencil to pass through. No one was getting in or out of that space without major effort and considerable noise. I completed my shift wondering if I was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Divorce does strange things to your perception, Dr. Martinez had mentioned. Sleep deprivation can cause you to hear sounds that aren't there, but hallucinations typically vary in content and timing. They don't repeat exactly every night at the same minute. The third night brought a new development. At 12:30 a.m., during my first perimeter check, I heard music coming from room 7. Not children's music, but classical piano, something slow and melancholy that might have been Chopin or Debussy. The door was closed, but soft light leaked from the gap at the bottom. Someone had left the classroom lights on and possibly a radio or CD player running. I checked the rules again. Rule 3 said to assume voices were from outside the building, but it didn't specifically mention music. And the lights suggested equipment that had been left running rather than some supernatural phenomenon. This felt like a maintenance issue that warranted investigation. I tried the door handle. It turned easily. Room 7 was a fourth-grade classroom with desks arranged in clusters of 4, walls decorated with multiplication tables, and a solar system poster that showed Pluto, as the ninth planet. The lights were on, but there was no radio, no CD player, no obvious source for the music I'd heard. The piano melody continued, seeming to come from the air itself rather than any specific location. As I stood in the doorway listening, the music gradually faded until only silence remained. I checked the room thoroughly. No hidden speakers, no electronic devices, no equipment that could generate sound. The music had simply stopped when I'd opened the door, as if my presence had interrupted something private. I turned off the lights, closed the door, and noted the incident in the log. 12:30 a.m. Music from room 7. Investigated. Lights were on. No source found. Lights turned off. Walking back to the office, I had the distinct impression that I'd violated some unspoken protocol. Not the written rules, which I'd followed carefully, but some deeper understanding about how to coexist with whatever was happening in this building. The children's laughter at 2:43 a.m. felt different that night, more subdued, as if my intrusion into room 7 had been noticed and judged. By my fourth night, I developed a theory. Whitmore Elementary had been closed for 4 years, but some residue of its active period remained. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but echoes of routine and familiarity that persisted in the absence of their sources. The 2:43 a.m. laughter might correspond to a recess period from when the school was operational. The piano music might be the remnant of after-school programs or music classes that had once filled room 7. This explanation satisfied my rational mind without requiring belief in supernatural phenomena. Buildings can hold impressions of their former purposes, especially places that have been filled with strong emotions and consistent activities. Whitmore had been an elementary school for 67 years before closing. That's a lot of accumulated routine, enough to leave permanent imprints on the environment. I was testing this theory when I encountered my first serious violation of the rules. During my 2 a.m. perimeter check on the fourth night, I found room 14's door standing open. The yellow tape was still in place, but someone had cut through it cleanly and folded it back like curtains. The authorized personnel only sign hung askew on a single piece of tape. Soft light spilled from the room into the hallway. Rule 5 was explicit. Room 14 was off limits under any circumstances. But the door was open, the light was on, and someone had clearly been inside. This wasn't a residual echo or building settling. This was recent human activity that required investigation. I approached the doorway carefully, flashlight ready despite the illumination coming from within. Room 14 was different from the other classrooms I'd seen. The desks were pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center of the room. The walls were covered with children's artwork, but not the seasonal decorations I'd seen elsewhere. These drawings were more elaborate, more detailed, and they all depicted the same subject. Every piece of artwork showed the school building, but not as it currently existed. These drawings showed Whitmore Elementary in cross-section, like a dollhouse with one wall removed, revealing all the rooms and hallways simultaneously. The gymnasium was shown filled with children, but the children in these drawings didn't look quite right. Their proportions were slightly wrong, their faces too angular, their eyes too large. And in every drawing, there was an additional room that didn't exist in the actual building's layout. A basement level that extended beneath the entire structure, with tunnels connecting to spaces outside the school's footprint. If this story is drawing you in and making you wonder what's really happening in that school, a quick like helps more people discover mysteries like this. In the center of the open floor space, someone had arranged a circle of tiny chairs, the kind made for kindergarten students. Each chair faced inward toward a larger chair that looked like it belonged in the teacher's lounge. On the larger chair sat a composition notebook, open to a page covered with handwriting. I knew I should leave immediately. Rule 5 couldn't have been clearer, and whatever was happening in room 14 was definitely beyond the scope of my security responsibilities. But the notebook seemed to be positioned deliberately, as if someone wanted it to be found and read. The handwriting was adult, not a child's, and it appeared to be recent based on the ink quality and paper condition. I stepped into the room and read the open page. Day 23. The children are more responsive now. They understand that their presence here serves a specific purpose, and they're beginning to communicate more effectively. The 2:43 a.m. gatherings are becoming more structured. Instead of random play, they're engaging in organized activities that suggest retention of educational programming. This supports Dr. Henley's hypothesis about consciousness persistence in familiar environments. Day 24. Breakthrough. One of the subjects, a girl approximately 7 years old with brown hair and pigtails, spoke directly to me during last night's session. Her words were clear. "We know you're watching us." This indicates not only retained speech capability, but awareness of observation. The implications are significant. Day 25. The security guard has been interfering with our research protocols. His perimeter checks are disrupting the subject's comfort levels, and his investigation of room 7 yesterday caused a notable decrease in activity. We may need to modify his instructions or consider alternative arrangements. Day 26. Success. The subjects have agreed to demonstrate their capabilities for documentation purposes. Tonight's gathering will include physical manifestations beyond simple vocalization. The guard will be invited to observe under controlled conditions. If he proves receptive to collaboration, we can proceed to the next phase of the study. The entry was dated 3 days ago. Today was day 26. I flipped backward through the notebook, finding weeks of similar entries describing research protocols and subjects and consciousness persistence studies. The handwriting was consistent throughout, suggesting a single author who had been accessing the building regularly despite the security arrangements. The earliest entries detailed preliminary observations from several months ago. Someone had been studying the phenomena at Whitmore Elementary long before my employment began. References to Dr. Henley's research protocols and funding from the Meridian Foundation suggested this was formal academic work rather than amateur ghost hunting. I photographed several pages with my phone, though I doubted the images would be clear enough to read later. The handwriting was dense, technical language mixed with personal observations about subject behavior and manifestation patterns. One entry from 2 weeks ago stood out. The security position has proven essential for maintaining consistent access. Guards typically resign within days due to discomfort with phenomena, but extended observation periods are necessary for meaningful data collection. So the security job was intentional misdirection. Someone wanted a witness present during specific hours, someone who would document the activities but remain uninformed about their true nature. The previous guards hadn't quit due to fear. They'd been replaced when they'd served their purpose or become too curious about what they were observing. The question was whether I'd been selected for the same reason, or if Day 20 SIXS, controlled observation, meant something more direct. I closed the notebook and backed out of room 14, careful not to disturb the chair arrangement. The yellow tape was easy to fold back into place, though the cut edges would be obvious to anyone who examined them closely. I noted the incident in the log as room 14 found open, secured, and resealed, which was technically accurate without being complete. The rest of my shift proceeded normally, if you could call anything about this job normal. At 2:43 a.m., the children's laughter returned, but it sounded different now that I understood it might be part of a structured research study. Less like residual echoes and more like active participation in something ongoing. I paid closer attention to the details. The laughter was definitely coming from the gymnasium, but there were other sounds underneath it. Footsteps, chair legs scraping against the floor, adult voices speaking in low tones. Not children playing unsupervised, but children being guided through some kind of organized activity by people who knew exactly what they were doing. At 3 a.m., Rule 10 required me to stand in the center of the main hallway for 60 seconds without reacting to anything I heard. This had seemed like an arbitrary insurance requirement when Jim explained it, but in the context of the research notebook, it felt more like data collection. Someone wanted to observe my behavior during a specific time frame, document my compliance with instructions, maybe test my reactions to controlled stimuli. I walked to the designated location and began counting silently. At 15 seconds, I heard footsteps approaching from the direction of room 14. Slow, measured steps that suggested an adult walking purposefully rather than wandering randomly. At 30 seconds, I could hear breathing that wasn't my own, close enough to suggest someone standing within arm's reach. At 45 seconds, a voice spoke directly into my right ear. "Thank you for your cooperation, Marcus." The voice was male, middle-aged, with the precise diction of someone accustomed to lecturing or giving presentations. He knew my name despite the fact that I'd never introduced myself to anyone except Jim Morrison, and he was thanking me for cooperation that I hadn't knowingly provided. I completed the full 60 seconds without moving or responding, as Rule 10 required. When I turned around, the hallway was empty. No footsteps retreating, no doors closing, no indication that anyone had been present except for the lingering awareness that I'd been observed and evaluated. The final hours of my shift felt different. The building's atmosphere had shifted from mysterious to purposeful, as if invisible activity was happening around me with increased intensity. I could sense movement in rooms I wasn't supposed to enter, hear quiet conversations that stopped when I approached, feel the weight of attention from people I couldn't see. When 6 a.m. arrived and I locked up to leave, a man was waiting by my car in the parking lot. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a dark suit that looked expensive despite the early hour. Wire-rimmed glasses, graying hair combed neatly, the kind of professional appearance you'd expect from a university professor or research administrator. He smiled as I approached, the sort of warm but calculated expression that suggested he was comfortable managing difficult conversations. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. "Dr. William Henley. I believe you've been reading my research notes." I didn't take his hand. "You've been watching me." "Observing," he corrected. "There's a distinction. You've been performing your security duties with admirable attention to detail, and you've shown curiosity about phenomena that most people would prefer to ignore. Those are valuable qualities for what we're trying to accomplish here." "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Dr. Henley walked closer to my car, not threatening, but clearly intending to extend our conversation. "Consciousness persistence research. The study of how human awareness might continue to function after traditional biological markers indicate cessation of life. Whitmore Elementary provides unique conditions for this research due to the emotional significance of the location and the traumatic circumstances that led to its closure." Traumatic circumstances? The building wasn't closed due to district consolidation, Marcus. That was the official explanation, but the reality is more complex. In March 2019, there was an incident during after-school programming. A structural collapse in the basement level trapped 11 children and 2 teachers for approximately 6 hours. By the time rescue crews reached them, 8 of the children had died from injuries and asphyxiation. The basement level, the same underground space depicted in all the children's drawings in room 14. The surviving children and teachers described experiences during those 6 hours that were inconsistent with conventional understanding of consciousness during extreme trauma. They reported continued interaction with the children who had died, described conversations and activities that occurred after medical intervention was no longer possible. The local authorities dismissed these accounts as stress-induced hallucinations, but the consistency of the reports suggested something more significant. Dr. Henley adjusted his glasses, the gesture of someone settling in for a longer explanation than I wanted to hear. The Meridian Foundation specializes in research into consciousness phenomena that challenge traditional scientific paradigms. We've been studying Whitmore Elementary since 2020, documenting evidence that the children who died in the basement continue to maintain some form of awareness and agency within the building. The 2:43 a.m. gatherings correspond to the time period when the collapse occurred. The children have been trying to continue their after-school programming despite their altered circumstances. That's impossible, is it? You've heard them yourself. Multiple guards have documented the same phenomena occurring at predictable intervals with consistent characteristics. That's not imagination or psychological suggestion. That's measurable, repeatable data indicating organized activity by conscious entities. If you're fascinated by stories that blur the line between scientific research and the unexplainable, consider subscribing for more investigations into places where reality gets complicated. I looked at Dr. Henley and tried to process what he was suggesting. 8 children had died in the basement of this building 4 years ago. Their deaths had been covered up with a story about district consolidation to avoid liability and media attention. And now researchers were studying evidence that those children were somehow still present, still interacting with their environment in ways that could be observed and documented. Why are you telling me this? Because tonight is the culmination of 6 months of research. The children have agreed to participate in a direct communication session that will provide definitive proof of consciousness persistence. Your presence as an independent witness will be crucial for peer review and publication. You've already established rapport with the subjects through your consistent, non-threatening security rounds. They trust you enough to maintain their regular activities despite your observation. I never agreed to be part of a research study. No, but you've been participating in one nonetheless. Every entry in your security log, every documentation of unusual phenomena, every compliance with the specific rules designed to create optimal conditions for observation. You've been an invaluable research partner, Marcus, whether you realized it or not. Dr. Henley reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope thick enough to contain substantial paperwork. The Meridian Foundation is prepared to offer you a consulting contract for tonight's session. Direct observation and documentation of a controlled consciousness persistence demonstration. The compensation is $25,000 for approximately 4 hours of work. $25,000. More than enough to pay off my credit cards, catch up on the therapy bills, maybe put down a deposit on a decent apartment somewhere else. The money would solve the immediate financial crisis that had led me to take this job in the first place. All I had to do was witness whatever Dr. Henley had planned for tonight and write an accurate report of what I observed. What exactly would I be witnessing? The children will demonstrate their continued ability to interact with physical objects, respond to direct questions, and engage in cooperative problem-solving activities. Nothing harmful or disturbing, simply evidence that consciousness can persist in familiar environments even after traditional biological indicators suggest otherwise. You'll observe from a safe distance and document what you see for our research files. I thought about Sarah asking for alimony modifications because my irregular income made the original divorce settlement impractical. I thought about Dr. Martinez suggesting more frequent sessions to work through my adjustment issues at $160 per appointment. I thought about the overdue notices accumulating on my kitchen counter and the growing awareness that my current income wouldn't cover my basic expenses much longer. If I agree to this, do I still keep the security job? The security position was always temporary, designed to establish optimal conditions for tonight's demonstration. Regardless of your decision about participating in the research session, your employment at Whitmore Elementary ends after this week. So the job was ending anyway. I could walk away now with 1 week's pay, or I could stay for one more night and earn enough money to stabilize my situation for several months. The rational choice was obvious, even if I didn't fully understand what I'd be agreeing to witness. I'll do it. Dr. Henley smiled and handed me the envelope. Excellent. The session begins at 11 p.m. and should conclude by 3 a.m. Report to the gymnasium entrance instead of the main office. My colleague Dr. Sarah Chun will provide you with specific instructions for observation and documentation protocols. He walked toward a gray sedan parked at the far end of the lot, then paused and turned back. Marcus, one important detail. Tonight's session represents a breakthrough in consciousness persistence research that could revolutionize our understanding of human awareness and mortality. What you observe may challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death. I want you to be prepared for that possibility. I watched him drive away, then sat in my car for 20 minutes reading through the contract. Standard consulting agreement, liability waivers, confidentiality clauses that prohibited me from discussing anything I observed without written permission from the Meridian Foundation. The compensation section was clear: $25,000 upon completion of the observation session and submission of a detailed written report. I signed the contract and drove home wondering what I'd committed myself to witness. That evening, I arrived at Whitmore Elementary at 10:45 p.m. to find the parking lot occupied by 3 vehicles I didn't recognize. 2 sedans and a van with tinted windows, all parked near the gymnasium entrance rather than the main building entrance I'd been using for the past week. Portable lighting equipment had been set up along the walkway, creating a path from the parking lot to the gym doors. Dr. Chun was waiting for me near the entrance. She looked younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with shoulder-length black hair and the sort of professional casual attire that suggested academic credentials without institutional stuffiness. She was carrying a tablet and an equipment case that looked heavy enough to contain serious recording gear. Marcus, thank you for joining us tonight. Dr. Henley explained that you've been observing the children's activities for the past week, so you're already familiar with their behavioral patterns. Tonight will be similar, but more direct and structured. She led me toward the gymnasium doors, which were no longer chained shut. The heavy padlocks had been removed, and the doors stood partially open to reveal portable lighting equipment and what looked like scientific monitoring devices inside. We've been preparing for this session for 3 months, Dr. Chun continued as we walked. The children have been gradually becoming more responsive to direct communication attempts, and they've agreed to participate in activities that will demonstrate their continued cognitive capabilities. Your role will be to observe from a designated location and document what you see without interfering with the research protocols. Inside the gymnasium, the scene was more elaborate than I'd anticipated. The basketball hoops had been retracted, and the center of the floor space was arranged with 2 distinct areas. On one side, small chairs were arranged in a circle around a low table with various objects placed on its surface: building blocks, coloring books, simple puzzles, and toys that looked appropriate for elementary school-aged children. On the other side, sophisticated recording equipment had been set up, including cameras pointed at the children's area, audio monitoring devices, and computers displaying real-time data streams. Dr. Henley was adjusting one of the cameras when we entered. He looked more casual than he had in the parking lot earlier, wearing dark jeans and a polo shirt instead of the formal suit. 2 other people were present, a woman in her 40s operating the computer equipment and a younger man positioning additional lighting. Marcus, meet the rest of our research team. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison handles data analysis, and David Kim manages our technical equipment. We're a small group, but we specialize in consciousness persistence phenomena. Dr. Morrison looked up from her computer screen and smiled briefly. We've been reviewing your security reports from the past week. Very detailed observations, exactly the kind of data that helps us understand the children's activity patterns. I realized that my innocent security logs had been research data all along. Every documentation of unusual sounds, every note about the 2:43 a.m. laughter, every timestamp and location detail had been feeding into their study of whatever was happening in this building. David Kim finished positioning a camera and walked over to Dr. Chen. Audio levels are optimal, visual recording is synchronized, and the motion sensors are calibrated. We should be ready to begin by 11:15. Dr. Chen led me to a folding chair positioned about 15 feet from the children's activity area. A small table next to the chair held a notebook, several pens, and a digital voice recorder. Your documentation will be crucial for peer review, she explained. Write down everything you observe, including timestamps, descriptions of physical interactions, any vocalizations you hear, and your subjective impressions of the children's emotional states and communication attempts. The digital recorder will capture audio, but written observations provide context that technical equipment might miss. I sat down and looked around the gymnasium. It felt different from the empty, institutional space I'd imagined during my perimeter checks. The lighting created a warm, welcoming atmosphere that resembled a classroom or daycare center more than a research laboratory. If you ignored the monitoring equipment, this could have been a normal after-school program preparing for evening activities. At 11:20 p.m., the session began. The first indication that something was happening came through the audio monitoring system. Dr. Morrison's computers started displaying sound wave patterns and frequency analyses that suggested vocalization even though I couldn't hear anything yet. The graphs showed regular patterns consistent with speech, multiple voices of different pitches and timbres. "They're here," Dr. Chen said quietly, making notes on her tablet. Beginning pre-activity communication phase. Gradually, I started to hear what the equipment had already detected. Quiet voices, children talking among themselves in the way kids do when they're deciding what game to play or how to organize their activities. The voices were coming from the children's area, but I couldn't see anyone there. Just empty chairs arranged around a table with toys and activities waiting to be used. Then the chairs started moving. Not dramatically, not the kind of supernatural phenomena you'd expect from a haunted house movie. The chairs shifted slightly as if someone was sitting down, the subtle adjustments that happen when people settle into their seats. One chair scooted closer to the table. Another turned at a slight angle. The movements were natural and purposeful, consistent with children arranging themselves for a group activity. The voices became clearer as the seating arrangement finalized. I could distinguish individual speakers, a girl with a higher-pitched voice who seemed to be organizing the activity, a boy who kept asking questions, another girl with a slight lisp who was commenting on the available toys. "Okay, everyone sits down," said the girl who appeared to be taking charge. "Mrs. Patterson said we should work on our art project first. Then we can have free playtime." Mrs. Patterson, one of the teachers who had died in the basement collapse, according to Dr. Henley's explanation. "I want to use the red crayons," said the boy. "Can I draw the fire truck we saw yesterday?" Yesterday, from the perspective of children who had died for years ago, but they were discussing it as if it had been a recent, normal experience. The coloring books on the table opened to specific pages without anyone visible turning them. Crayons lifted from their containers and began moving across the paper, creating drawings that materialized in real time as if invisible hands were holding them. The artwork was typical of elementary school students. Simple figures, bright colors, the kind of enthusiastic but technically imperfect drawings you'd expect from 7- and 8-year-old children. Have you ever witnessed something that defied logical explanation but felt completely natural at the same time? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Dr. Chun was documenting everything on her tablet, occasionally whispering updates to Dr. Morrison, who was monitoring the technical data streams. David Kim moved quietly around the perimeter, adjusting camera angles to capture the activity from multiple perspectives. I wrote in my notebook, 11:25 p.m., chairs arranged by invisible occupants, multiple child voices discussing art activities, crayons moving independently to create drawings. Movements appear natural and purposeful, consistent with normal after-school program behavior. The drawing session continued for about 20 minutes. The children discussed their artwork, asked each other questions about color choices, and occasionally requested specific supplies. The crayons and markers moved smoothly across the paper in fluid motions that suggested practiced familiarity with the materials. The completed drawings showed typical childhood subjects: houses with smoke curling from chimneys, stick figure families, dogs and cats with disproportionately large heads, rainbows arcing over simple landscapes. What struck me most was how ordinary it all seemed. These weren't the tortured communications of trapped spirits or the chaotic manifestations of supernatural energy. This was a regular after-school art session conducted by children who happened to be invisible. They helped each other reach supplies, complimented each other's work, and occasionally argued about sharing materials in exactly the way living children would behave. At 11:47 p.m., the girl who seemed to be the group leader announced that art time was over and they should move to the puzzle activity. The chairs scraped against the floor as their invisible occupants stood up and moved to a different section of the table where several jigsaw puzzles had been laid out. I could hear footsteps, quiet conversations about which puzzle to attempt first, and the familiar sound of puzzle pieces being sorted and examined. "I want to do the one with the horses," said the girl with the lisp. "That one's too hard, Emma," replied the boy. "Let's do the farm picture. It only has 50 pieces." Emma, a specific name, a distinct personality, a child who preferred challenging puzzles and had opinions about the available options. Not a generic ghost or energy manifestation, but an individual person with preferences and social relationships that had persisted beyond death. Dr. Morrison was monitoring her computer displays with increased intensity, occasionally making notes on a separate tablet. The data streams showed complex patterns of electromagnetic activity, temperature fluctuations, and audio frequencies that corresponded to the children's activities. Whatever was happening here was generating measurable physical effects that went far beyond simple auditory hallucinations. The puzzle session revealed even more specific details about the children's personalities and relationships. Emma did indeed prefer the more complex puzzles, and she was apparently skilled at organizing group activities. The boy, who was called Jason by the others, asked frequent questions and needed encouragement to stay focused on tasks. A third voice, belonging to a girl named Lily, served as a mediator when disagreements arose about puzzle strategies. These weren't the vague, generic communications typically associated with paranormal phenomena. These were detailed, consistent personality profiles of specific children who maintained their individual characteristics and social dynamics despite their altered circumstances. Dr. Chen approached my observation area and spoke quietly. How are you finding the documentation process? Any questions about what you're observing? They're so normal, I said. I was expecting something more dramatic. That's one of our most significant findings. Consciousness persistence doesn't appear to fundamentally alter personality or cognitive function. The children retain their memories, preferences, social relationships, and learning capabilities. Death, at least in their case, was more like a change in physical accessibility than a change in mental capacity. What about the teachers who were trapped with them? Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Rodriguez are here as well, but they typically maintain a supervisory role rather than participating directly in activities. You'll probably hear from them during the question and answer session that Dr. Henley has planned for later tonight. As if summoned by our conversation, an adult voice spoke from the children's activity area. Female, middle-aged, with the authoritative but nurturing tone that experienced elementary school teachers develop after years of managing classroom dynamics. Children, let's clean up the puzzle area and prepare for our science demonstration. Dr. Henley has some questions he'd like to ask, and we want to show him how much we've learned. The response was immediate. Puzzle pieces moved across the table surface as invisible hands gathered and sorted them back into their original containers. Chairs were pushed back into neat arrangements. The activity area was organized with the kind of efficiency that suggested well-established routines and clear expectations about cleanup procedures. Mrs. Patterson's voice continued. Emma, please make sure the art supplies are properly organized. Jason, help Lily with the puzzle boxes. Everyone remember to use your best listening skills when Dr. Henley asks his questions. Dr. Henley stepped forward from his position near the monitoring equipment, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone about to conduct a formal interview. His casual attire from earlier had been replaced with a dress shirt and tie, as if the occasion required more professional presentation. Good evening, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for organizing tonight's demonstration. I hope everyone is comfortable with the research protocols we discussed. We're ready, Dr. Henley. The children have been practicing their presentations, and they're excited to show you what they've been working on. This was clearly a planned curriculum, not a spontaneous manifestation. The children had been preparing for tonight's session, working with their teacher to develop demonstrations that would satisfy the researchers' requirements for evidence of continued consciousness and learning capability. Dr. Henley consulted his clipboard. Let's begin with individual introductions. Each child should state their name, age, and favorite subject, then answer one question about their current activities here at the school. I'll go first, said Emma's voice, coming from the area near the art supplies. My name is Emma Louise Crawford. I'm 8 years old, and my favorite subject is reading. Dr. Henley, I've been helping Mrs. Patterson organize our library corner, and I've read 17 books since we started keeping track. The precision of that response was striking. Not only was Emma maintaining her individual identity and preferences, she was also engaging in ongoing educational activities and tracking her progress in measurable ways. This suggested not just consciousness persistence, but continued intellectual development. Thank you, Emma. Jason, you're next. I'm Jason Michael Torres. I'm 7, and I like science the best. We've been doing experiments with how sounds travel through different materials, and I learned that sound moves faster through solid things than through air. Want me to show you? Perhaps later, Jason. Lily, your introduction, please. My name is Lily and Sean. A pause. I'm 8 years old, and art is my favorite, but I also like math. Mrs. Patterson has been teaching us about patterns, and I've been making pattern pictures with different shapes and colors. Dr. Chun, who had been monitoring the session from her position near the computers, looked startled when she heard Lily's last name. She approached Dr. Henley and whispered something that made him check his clipboard with increased attention. Lily, what's your mother's name? Dr. Henley asked. Sarah May Chun. She works at the university with computers and research projects. She's really smart, and she travels a lot for her job. Dr. Chun stepped forward, her professional composure visibly shaken. Lily, this is Dr. Sarah Chun. I'm your mother. The silence that followed was profound. Not just the absence of sound, but the kind of suspended moment that occurs when unexpected emotional revelations intersect with impossible circumstances. Dr. Chun was confronting the reality that her own daughter was among the children who had died in the basement collapse, and that daughter had been participating in consciousness persistence research without either of them initially realizing the personal connection. Mom, Lily's voice was tentative, hopeful, and heartbreaking. Are you really here? I've been wanting to talk to you, but Mrs. Patterson said we had to wait until the research people said it was okay. Dr. Chin moved toward the children's activity area, tears streaming down her face. I'm here, sweetheart. I've been trying to understand what happened to you, and I've been missing you so much. I miss you too, Mom, but it's okay here. Mrs. Patterson takes good care of us, and we still get to learn new things. I've been practicing my reading, and I made you a drawing. Do you want to see it? One of the completed artworks from the earlier session lifted from the table and moved through the air toward Dr. Chun. It was a crayon drawing of two figures holding hands, one larger and one smaller, standing in front of a house with flowers in the yard. At the top of the page, in the careful block letters of an 8-year-old, were the words, I love you, Mom. Dr. Chun took the drawing with trembling hands, examining every detail as if trying to memorize it. It's beautiful, Lily. I love it, and I love you. The emotional intensity of the reunion was affecting everyone present. Dr. Morrison was crying quietly at her monitoring station. David Kim had stopped adjusting equipment and was watching the interaction with obvious amazement. Even Dr. Henley, who had presumably been preparing for this moment, seemed moved by witnessing the direct connection between his research subjects and their living family members. But the session wasn't over. Mrs. Patterson's voice gently redirected attention back to the planned demonstrations. Dr. Henley, the children have prepared a group presentation about their science project. They've been studying how temperature affects different materials, and they'd like to show you their findings. Dr. Henley cleared his throat and consulted his clipboard again, though his professional demeanor was clearly affected by what he'd just witnessed. Of course, please proceed with your demonstration. What followed was a remarkably sophisticated presentation for elementary school students. The children had apparently been conducting experiments with various materials, observing how they responded to temperature changes and documenting their results in organized data collection. They described their methodology, presented their findings, and drew conclusions about the physical properties of different substances. Jason took the lead, explaining that they had tested metal, wood, plastic, and cloth by exposing samples to different temperature conditions and measuring the results. Emma provided supporting details about their data collection methods. Lily described the patterns they had observed and how those patterns related to the molecular structure of the materials. The level of scientific understanding demonstrated by 8-year-old children was impressive enough, but the fact that they were conducting these experiments and developing these insights while existing in their altered state raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness, learning, and intellectual development beyond traditional biological constraints. If you want to stay updated on more investigations into the unexplained boundaries between life, death, and consciousness, hit that notification bell. Dr. Morrison was documenting every detail on her computers, creating permanent records of communications and interactions that challenged fundamental assumptions about mortality and human awareness. The data streams showed consistent patterns of intelligent, organized activity by entities that had no detectable physical presence according to conventional measurement tools. At 1:15 a.m., Dr. Henley announced a transition to the individual consultation phase of the session. This would involve direct question-and-answer interactions between the research team and specific children, focusing on their memories of the incident that had led to their current circumstances and their understanding of their altered state. Emma, you were one of the older children present during the basement incident. Can you describe what you remember about that day? Emma's response was immediate and detailed. We were having after-school art club in the basement classroom because the main art room was being painted. Mrs. Patterson was helping us work on our Mother's Day cards, and Mr. Rodriguez was setting up the kiln for pottery projects. There were 14 of us altogether. 14 children, not the 11 that Dr. Henley had mentioned in his earlier explanation. This discrepancy was significant if Emma's memory was accurate. What happened when the collapse occurred? There was a loud cracking sound from the ceiling, and then dust started falling down. Mrs. Patterson told everyone to get under the tables, but the ceiling came down really fast. Some of the children got hurt by the falling pieces, and we couldn't get to the stairs because they were blocked. Do you remember what happened next? We were trapped for a really long time. Some of the children were hurt badly, and Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Rodriguez were trying to help them. But then something strange happened. The hurt children started feeling better, and they could talk and move around even though they looked different. Different in what way? They looked kind of transparent, like you could see through them a little bit. And they didn't seem to hurt anymore, even the ones who had been crying before. Mrs. Patterson said maybe it was because we were all together and looking out for each other. This was a first-hand account of the transition from life to their current state, described by someone who had experienced it directly. Emma was reporting that the injured children had somehow recovered from their physical trauma while simultaneously becoming less physically substantial, a transformation that had occurred during the hours they were trapped, witnessed by surviving members of the group. Emma, do you understand that your physical body died during the incident? Yes, Dr. Henley. Mrs. Patterson explained it to us after the rescue people finally came. She said that our bodies stopped working, but the part of us that thinks and feels and remembers found a way to stay together. She said it's like how a candle flame can light other candles without getting smaller itself. This was a remarkably sophisticated understanding of consciousness persistence for an 8-year-old child, but it was also a framework that had apparently been provided by Mrs. Patterson to help the children process their unusual circumstances. Dr. Henley continued his questioning with Jason and Lily, documenting similar accounts of the transition process and their current understanding of their altered state. Each child provided consistent details about the incident, their transformation, and their ongoing activities in the years since the collapse. The testimonies revealed that the children retained complete memories of their lives before the incident, maintained their individual personalities and relationships, and had continued learning and developing intellectually during the 4 years since their deaths. They understood their condition, had adapted to their altered capabilities, and had established new routines and goals appropriate to their circumstances. At 2:30 a.m., Mrs. Patterson requested permission to address the research team directly. Dr. Henley, I want to thank you and your colleagues for providing us with this opportunity to demonstrate our continued presence and capabilities. The children have been eager to show that they are still learning, still growing, and still capable of meaningful relationships with the people they care about. Her voice carried the authority and warmth that had probably made her an effective teacher during her lifetime. But now it also conveyed the wisdom of someone who had guided children through an impossible transition and helped them maintain their sense of purpose and identity in circumstances that had no precedent. We understand that our situation challenges conventional beliefs about life and death, but we hope that your research will help other people understand that consciousness can persist beyond traditional biological boundaries. The children have adapted remarkably well to their altered circumstances, and they continue to find joy in learning, creativity, and friendship. Dr. Henley was taking extensive notes, capturing Mrs. Patterson's statements for inclusion in the research documentation. Mrs. Patterson, what message would you want the outside world to understand about your situation here? That love and learning are more resilient than physical limitations. These children have faced the most difficult transition imaginable, but they've maintained their curiosity, their creativity, and their capacity for growth. Death changed their circumstances, but it didn't diminish their humanity. The session concluded at 2:45 a.m. with a group farewell. Each child addressed the research team individually, thanking them for the opportunity to participate and expressing hope that the documentation would help other people understand their continued existence. Dr. Chun had a private conversation with Lily that was both heartbreaking and uplifting, a mother reconnecting with her daughter across circumstances that should have made such communication impossible. As the gymnasium returned to quiet, Dr. Henley approached my observation area to collect my documentation notebook and discuss my impressions of the session. Marcus, you've witnessed something that challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness, death, and the nature of human identity. How do you process what you've observed? I looked at my notebook, filled with detailed descriptions of impossible interactions, measurable phenomena with no detectable physical sources, and evidence of continued consciousness and intellectual development by children who had been dead for 4 years. I don't know how to process it, I admitted. Everything I witnessed contradicts what I thought I understood about life and death, but it all felt completely natural while it was happening. Like this was just a normal after-school program with students who happened to be invisible. That's an insightful observation. The children have maintained their essential characteristics and social dynamics. Their altered physical state hasn't fundamentally changed who they are or their capacity for learning and growth. Dr. Chun joined our conversation, still carrying Lily's drawing and clearly affected by the reunion with her daughter. Marcus, your documentation will be crucial for peer review and publication. You observe these interactions as an independent witness without preconceptions about what you might see. Your testimony provides credibility that our internal research team couldn't offer. I handed over my notebook, knowing that my detailed observations would become part of a research study that could revolutionize scientific understanding of consciousness and mortality. The $25,000 consulting fee seemed almost insignificant compared to the magnitude of what I'd witnessed and documented. The research team spent another hour packing their equipment and securing the gymnasium. By 4 a.m., the building had returned to its normal state of apparent emptiness, though I now understood that empty was a misleading description. 8 children and 2 teachers continued to inhabit these spaces, maintaining their educational programs and social relationships in ways that transcended traditional physical limitations. Dr. Henley walked me to my car as dawn approached. Marcus, you've participated in groundbreaking research that will be published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at academic conferences worldwide. Your observations provide independent verification of consciousness persistence phenomena that could change how humanity understands death and the nature of identity. I drove home as the sun rose, carrying the envelope with my consulting contract and payment, but also carrying questions that would fundamentally alter how I understood existence itself. The divorce that had seemed so catastrophic, the financial struggles that had driven me to take this job, even the therapy sessions focused on rebuilding my identity after major life changes. All of these concerns felt different now that I'd witnessed evidence that consciousness could persist beyond the ultimate life change. The money from the consulting contract solved my immediate financial problems. I paid off the credit cards, caught up on the therapy bills, and put a deposit down on a better apartment in a different part of town. But I couldn't escape the awareness that my problems had always been temporary and solvable. While 8 children had faced permanent separation from their families and physical existence, and had somehow found ways to continue learning, growing, and maintaining hope. Dr. Martinez noticed the change in my perspective during our next session. I told her about finding steady work that had given me a different outlook on loss and adaptation. I couldn't mention the details according to my confidentiality agreement, but I explained that I'd learned something about resilience from people who had faced much greater challenges than divorce and financial stress. 3 weeks later, I received a package from the Meridian Foundation. Inside was a published research paper titled "Documented Evidence of Consciousness Persistence in Controlled Environmental Conditions," with my name listed as a contributing observer. The paper would be presented at conferences, reviewed by scientists worldwide, and potentially change how humanity understood the relationship between consciousness and physical existence. But what stayed with me wasn't the academic recognition or the financial compensation. It was the sound of children laughing at 2:43 a.m., the careful way Emma organized art supplies, Jason's enthusiasm for science experiments, and most of all, Lily's drawing with its simple message of love that had bridged an impossible gap between life and death. I still drive past Whitmore Elementary sometimes, usually late at night when the building is dark and apparently empty. I know better now than to trust appearances about what spaces might contain or what forms of presence might persist in places where people once lived, learned, and cared for each other. Sometimes I wonder if the children are still there, still meeting for their after-school programs, still learning new things under Mrs. Patterson's guidance. I hope they are. I hope they've found ways to maintain contact with their families, like Dr. Chun found with Lily. And I hope that someday, the research will advance enough that these reunions won't require scientific equipment and formal protocols. The divorce papers are filed away in a folder I rarely open. The financial crisis that drove me to that security job feels like it happened to someone else. But I keep Lily's drawing on my refrigerator, a reminder that love and learning can persist beyond circumstances that seem impossible to survive. I never know for certain what I'm hearing when buildings settle at night.